In 2011, a Brazilian geophysicist named Valia Manethol Hamza published a paper that most people outside his field never read. It described a river, not the Amazon River, everyone knows that one, a different river, running 4,000 meters beneath the Amazon River in the same direction, roughly 6,000 kilometers long. It's called the Hamza River now, named after him. Nobody had ever looked for it before because nobody thought one could be there. It was found not by drilling or diving, but by analyzing temperature data from oil exploration wells that Brazil's state oil company had drilled decades earlier and essentially forgotten about. Hamza's team went back through those records, mapped the thermal gradients, and traced the outline of something vast and slow moving through the rock below. The Amazon has two rivers, one on the surface, one in the dark underground, moving about a millimeter per day, too slow to be called a river in the conventional sense, but too large to be called anything else. This is the kind of place the Amazon is. You think you understand its scale. You don't. You think you know what's in it. You don't. Scientists with instruments that didn't exist 30 years ago are still finding things that change the basic picture. In 2018, LIDAR surveys, lasers fired from aircraft that can pass through canopy gaps and bounce off the ground, revealed the outlines of a city beneath the trees in Bolivia's Llanos de Mojos region. Not a small settlement. A city with causeways, reservoirs and a canal system covering several hundred square kilometers hidden under the forest. Inhabited by tens of thousands of people, probably more than 1,000 years ago. Before the LIDAR, it was considered empty forest. The Amazon keeps doing this. Keeps turning out to be more than anyone calculated. More water, more species, more history, more engineering, both geological and human, than the current models accounted for. This is the story of what we know now, and some of what we still can't explain. Chapter 1. The Number Problem. The Amazon basin covers approximately 7.4 million square kilometers. That number is hard to hold in your head, so here's a comparison. The contiguous United States, everything except Alaska and Hawaii, covers about 8 million square kilometers. The Amazon basin is nearly as large as the entire lower 48 states. It spans 9 countries, though roughly 60% of it sits within Brazil. The Amazon River itself discharges about 209,000 cubic meters of water per second into the Atlantic Ocean. That's more than the next 7 largest rivers on Earth combined. When it floods, the Amazon creates a temporary inland sea. In wet season, the river can be 50 kilometers wide in places. Trees stand in 10 to 15 meters of water for weeks at a time. Fish swim through what was dry forest floor 6 months earlier, eating fruit that's fallen from submerged branches. The forest contains an estimated 390 billion individual trees. That number comes from a 2013 study published in Science led by Nigel Pittman at the Field Museum in Chicago, which extrapolated from 1,170 survey plots across the Amazon basin. 390 billion, about 50 trees for every human being alive today. Of those 390 billion trees, the study estimated they belong to roughly 16,000 different species. But 227 hyperdominant species account for half of all trees in the Amazon. The remaining 15,770-odd species share the other half. This is strange. It means the Amazon is simultaneously one of the most biodiverse forests on Earth and oddly dominated by a handful of species that appear in overwhelming numbers. Why those particular species dominate is an open question. One hypothesis, and it's one I'll come back to, involves humans. The Amazon basin receives somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 millimeters of rainfall per year, depending on location. That sounds like a weather statistic. It isn't just weather. The Amazon generates a meaningful fraction of its own rain. The mechanism behind that is one of the stranger discoveries in modern climatology, and we'll get to it shortly. Chapter 2. 55 million years in the making. The Amazon you see today didn't always flow east. For much of its early geological history, the Amazon River drained west toward the Pacific Ocean. The continent of South America was lower in the west. There were no Andes. Then, starting around 25 million years ago, the Nazca Plate, an oceanic tectonic plate in the Pacific, began subducting under the South American plate. The collision buckled the western edge of the continent upward, building the Andes. As the mountains rose, they closed off the western drainage. A massive inland sea formed in what's now the western Amazon basin. This sea, sometimes called the Piba system, persisted for millions of years. It was warm, shallow, and enormous, possibly larger than the modern Caribbean. It filled with freshwater species, fish, reptiles, mollusks. Many of the Amazon's fish lineages today trace back to species that evolved in this inland sea. Then, about 11 to 10 million years ago, the sea drained. It found an outlet east through what's now Brazil, and the Amazon River, as we know it, was born, flowing east into the Atlantic. This reverse drainage direction is part of why the Amazon is so biologically rich. The Andes uplift didn't just create a barrier. It also created a continuous rain shadow, where moisture-laden air rises, cools and dumps rain on the eastern slopes. The western Amazon receives some of the highest rainfall totals on the continent precisely because the Andes force air upward. The Amazon basin also sits on an ancient geological platform called the Guiana Shield in the north and the Brazilian Shield in the south, some of the oldest stable rock on Earth, in places more than 1.7 billion years old. These old, nutrient-poor soils underlie much of the Amazon, which creates a paradox. The Amazon is one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth, but its soils are terrible. Most of the nutrients in the Amazon aren't in the ground. They're in the living organisms, in the trees, the leaves, the fungi, the bacteria. When something dies and falls, it gets decomposed and taken up again so quickly that almost nothing percolates down into the mineral soil. The system holds its own nutrients in a tight closed loop. This has enormous implications. It means that when you clear Amazon forest, you don't get productive farmland underneath. You get thin, acidic, depleted soil that can support crops for maybe 3 to 5 years before it's exhausted. Then you need to clear more forest. But, and this is where it gets complicated, not all Amazon soils are the same. Chapter 3. The Flying Rivers. Here's something that almost nobody knew until the late 1970s. The Amazon doesn't just receive rain, it makes rain. A forest tree in the Amazon absorbs water through its roots and releases it through tiny pores in its leaves, a process called transpiration. A single large Amazon tree can transpire somewhere between 300 and 1,000 litres of water on a hot day. Multiply that by 390 billion trees across 7.4 million square kilometres. The Amazon releases an estimated 20 trillion litres of water vapour into the atmosphere every single day. Brazilian climatologist Enéas Salati was one of the first scientists to seriously measure this. In papers published in the early 1980s, Salati and his colleagues used isotopic analysis of rainfall across the Amazon basin to show that moisture recycled through the forest contributed significantly to rainfall further inland. Water that fell as rain in eastern Brazil evaporated and transpired back into the atmosphere, then fell again farther west, then evaporated and transpired again and again. Each kilometre of forest acts like a pump, taking surface water and sending it back into the sky. The result is what Brazilian meteorologist José Marengo helped document in the 1990s and 2000s. Atmospheric rivers of moisture that flow west to east across South America, sometimes called flying rivers. These are genuine rivers of water vapour, carrying moisture from the Amazon basin inland and southward, ultimately delivering rain to southeastern Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay and northern Argentina. São Paulo, a city of 22 million people, gets a significant share of its rainfall from these flying rivers. So does most of southern Brazil's agricultural region, which produces soybeans, corn and sugarcane that together generate a substantial portion of the global food supply. The Amazon doesn't just water itself, it waters a continent. Researchers Carlos Nobre and Antonio Donato Nobre, whose work on Amazon climate dynamics has been published repeatedly in journals including Nature, Climate Change, have spent decades trying to get this point across to policymakers. A forest that covers 7.4 million square kilometres isn't just a collection of trees. It's a piece of atmospheric infrastructure that runs the water cycle for half a continent. Remove enough of it and the water cycle breaks. The rain doesn't come, the farms don't produce, the cities go dry. We know the threshold exists. We don't know exactly where it is. Chapter 4. The species nobody can count. The Amazon contains somewhere between 10 and 15% of all species on Earth. That range is wide because we've never finished counting. And that's not a logistical complaint, it's a biological reality. New species are found every year. In 2023, WWF published a report noting that scientists had discovered 2,523 new species in the Amazon over the previous 4 years, roughly 1.7 new species per day. Fish, plants, reptiles, birds, insects. Many of these were described from museum specimens that had been sitting in storage for decades, waiting for someone with the right taxonomic knowledge to formally name them. The fish diversity is extreme. The Amazon basin contains an estimated 3,000 to 3,500 species of freshwater fish. Roughly 15% of all freshwater fish species on Earth. The Mississippi River, one of North America's major river systems, has around 375 species. The Amazon has roughly 10 times more. The reason involves geography and time. The Amazon basin is old, enormous, and hydrologically complex. Hundreds of separate river systems drain into the main channel. During past ice ages, when rainfall decreased and forests contracted, populations of animals and plants got cut off from each other by open savannas. Isolated populations evolved in parallel for thousands or millions of years and became distinct species. When the forest expanded again during wetter periods, those species were already separate. They came back into contact but didn't merge back together. This theory, the Refugia hypothesis, formalized by German ornithologist Jürgen Hafer in 1969, helps explain the sheer density of closely related but distinct species you find in the Amazon. It's not just that the Amazon is big, it's that the Amazon is old enough and has varied enough over time that speciation happened repeatedly across the same landscape. Birds are the best documented group in the Amazon, about 1,300 species. Several dozen of those were only confirmed as distinct species after DNA analysis in the 2000s and 2010s. Birds that look almost identical but have been genetically separate for millions of years. Ornithologists call these cryptic species, and the Amazon appears to have a lot of them. Insects are essentially uncounted. Estimates for total insect species in the Amazon start at 2 million and go up from there. The honest scientific position is that we don't know. The forest canopy, 30 to 50 meters above the ground, mostly inaccessible until researchers started using cranes and climbing gear in the 1980s, turned out to harbour an entirely distinct community of organisms that wasn't catalogued for most of the 20th century because nobody had been up there to look. Chapter 5. The Dark Earth. Now for the thing that most people watching a documentary about the Amazon have probably never heard. Much of the Amazon's current forest may be the result of farming. Not modern farming, ancient farming. Pre-Columbian agriculture, practiced by indigenous civilizations that were growing cities in the Amazon basin before European contact. The evidence sits in the soil. across large areas of the Amazon, particularly in the middle and upper Amazon basin, in parts of Brazil and Peru. There are patches of unusually dark, fertile soil that researchers call terra preta, which is Portuguese for dark earth. These patches can cover anywhere from less than a hectare to more than 300 hectares. Some estimates put the total area of terra preta in the Amazon at between 0.1 and 0.3% of the basin, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that 0.1% of 7.4 million square kilometers is 7,400 square kilometers of soil that was intentionally manufactured. Terra preta contains far more organic carbon, nutrients and biological activity than the surrounding forest soil. It also contains charcoal, specifically a form of charcoal called biochar that resists decomposition for centuries. Alongside the charcoal, there are fragments of pottery, food remains, and bone. This isn't natural. Somebody made this soil. The leading explanation, developed substantially by Bruno Glaser at the University of Bayreuth and William Woods at the University of Kansas in the late 1990s and 2000s, is that ancient Amazonian peoples deliberately created fertile agricultural soil by mixing charcoal, organic waste, and probably composted material into the otherwise poor Amazon earth. The resulting soil is so stable that 1,000-year-old terra preta plots are still more fertile today than surrounding forest soil. Some farmers in Brazil actively seek out and sell terra preta because it's so productive. The cities that sat on top of this soil were large by pre-Columbian standards. Archaeologist Anna Roosevelt at the Field Museum excavated Marajó Island, a large island at the mouth of the Amazon, in the 1980s and found evidence of a complex society that may have numbered in the hundreds of thousands at its peak. Earlier, archaeologists had dismissed Marajó as too seasonally flooded to support large settlements. Roosevelt's excavations showed monumental earthworks, artificial mounds covering over 100 hectares, that kept settlements above flood level while using the river's seasonal dynamics for agriculture. Then the LIDAR surveys started. In 2010, Brazilian researchers used aerial surveys to detect geoglyphs, massive geometric earthworks, some over 300 meters across, in the Acre region of Brazil, in an area that had been deforested relatively recently. Over 450 of these sites have now been mapped. They'd been hidden under the forest for centuries. In 2022, the journal Nature published a study describing the use of LIDAR to map a network of pre-Columbian urban sites in Bolivia's Llanos de Mojos, the one mentioned at the start of this script. The largest site, Cotoca, covered about 147 hectares and was connected to 26 other sites by a network of straight, raised roads. The whole system stretched across roughly 4,500 square kilometers. The archaeologists who published that study, led by Heiko Prumers at the German Archaeological Institute, estimated these cities were occupied between roughly 500 and 1,400 CE. European contact, starting in the late 1400s, introduced diseases against which Amazonian peoples had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Population estimates for pre-Columbian Amazonia range from 5 to 10 million people. Some estimates go higher. And the death rate from European diseases was catastrophic. Some communities lost 50 to 90% of their population within a generation. The forest grew back. Over the cities, over the farmland, over the engineered soil. By the time European explorers began seriously documenting the Amazon interior in the 17th and 18th centuries, most of what had been built was already overgrown. The hyperdominant tree species that dominate the Amazon today, several of the most common ones, Brazil nut, cacao, cashew, are species that ancient Amazonian peoples cultivated and spread deliberately. The 2017 study by Carolina Levis and colleagues, published in Science, analyzed the distribution of 85 known domesticated or semi-domesticated Amazonian tree species and found they were significantly overrepresented near known archaeological sites. The Amazon isn't pristine wilderness. It's a partially overgrown garden. Chapter 6. The Web Below. Under the Amazon floor, not 4,000 meters down, like the Hamza River, but just a few centimeters below the leaf litter, there's a communication network. Mycorrhizal fungi. Thread-like filaments called hyphae that connect tree roots to each other, often across hundreds of meters. The fungal threads trade phosphorus and nitrogen to the trees in exchange for carbon-rich sugars from photosynthesis. The trees can't get enough nutrients from the soil without the fungi. The fungi can't produce carbon compounds without the trees. Neither can do without the other. This relationship isn't controversial or fringe science. It's been studied since at least the 1880s, when German botanist Albert Bernhard Frank first coined the term mycorrhiza. What's been more recently studied and more debated is whether trees use these fungal networks to transfer nutrients and chemical signals to each other. The popular version of this idea, sometimes called the Wood Wide Web, has been simplified to the point of mild distortion in a lot of science writing. Trees probably do transfer carbon between each other through fungal networks. There's documented evidence of this, including a notable 1997 study by Suzanne Simard at the University of British Columbia showing carbon transfer between paper birch and Douglas fir seedlings through shared fungal networks. But the degree to which this represents coordinated communication versus passive resource sharing is still scientifically unsettled. What's not unsettled is that the mycorrhizal networks are critical infrastructure. A forest is not a collection of independent trees. It's a system, and the fungal networks are part of the connective tissue. When you cut a section of forest, you don't just remove trees, you break the network. The fungi die without hosts. The trees on the edges lose part of their nutrient supply. Recovery of a mycorrhizal network in a disturbed area can take decades. The Amazon floor also harbors an enormous diversity of bacteria. an estimated 10 to 100 million bacterial cells per gram of soil. Brazilian microbiologist Jorge Matza Rodrigues and colleagues working on the Terra Genome project have been cataloguing Amazon soil bacteria since the early 2010s. The diversity is genuinely extreme. A single handful of undisturbed Amazon soil likely contains more distinct bacterial species than there are bird species in all of North America. Many of these bacteria are involved in the nitrogen cycle, taking atmospheric nitrogen and converting it into forms plants can use. This is part of how the Amazon maintains its productivity despite the nutrient-poor soil. The biology itself closes the gap the geology creates. Chapter 7. What the river does to the ocean. The Amazon River dumps approximately 6.6 trillion kilograms of suspended sediment into the Atlantic Ocean every year. This sediment, silt, clay, organic material, nutrients, creates the largest river plume in the world. The plume extends over 1.3 million square kilometers of ocean surface, visible from satellite, spreading northeast along the coast of South America and into the Caribbean. The plume is not just colored water. It's a nutrient delivery system. The Amazon carries dissolved iron, phosphorus, nitrogen, and silica out into the Atlantic. These nutrients feed phytoplankton, microscopic algae that form the base of the ocean food chain and that, through photosynthesis, capture carbon dioxide and release oxygen. The Amazon's plume drives phytoplankton blooms across a stretch of ocean far larger than the river's visible footprint. Here's the part that surprised oceanographers when they started measuring it properly in the 2000s and 2010s. The plume doesn't just stay near the surface. The mixing dynamics of the plume boundary, where Amazon freshwater meets saltier ocean water, can drive vertical circulation that carries nutrients much deeper. Research by oceanographer Patricia Medeiros at the University of Georgia and collaborators has shown that the Amazon plume influences carbon cycling across a portion of the Atlantic that extends well beyond what earlier models assumed. The Amazon also delivers something unusual to the Atlantic: significant amounts of dissolved organic carbon, partially decomposed plant material from the forest floor that gets carried into rivers and then out to sea. This material is ancient. Radiocarbon dating of Amazon River carbon sometimes shows material that's thousands of years old, leaching slowly out of old soil layers. The river is not just water, it's a slow export of thousands of years of biological history. Going the other direction, out of the ocean and into the Amazon, is dust from the Sahara Desert. This sounds improbable. It isn't. Jorge Prospero at the University of Miami began measuring Saharan dust crossing the Atlantic in the 1970s. By the 1990s and early 2000s, satellite data had confirmed the scale of it. An estimated 182 million metric tons of dust leave the Sahara each year. About 27 to 28 million metric tons crosses the Atlantic and reaches South America. Of that, about 22 million metric tons lands in the Amazon basin specifically. This dust carries phosphorus, the nutrient the Amazon's ancient soils are most deficient in. A 2015 study in Geophysical Research Letters by Yu Hongbin and colleagues used NASA's Calypso LiDAR satellite data to track the dust transport and estimated that approximately 22,000 metric tons of phosphorus reaches the Amazon basin from the Sahara each year. The Amazon's phosphorus budget is partly balanced by African desert dust arriving across 5,000 kilometers of ocean. The Sahara and the Amazon are connected. Remove one and the other changes. Chapter 8. The actual numbers on deforestation. From 1970 to 2023, the Brazilian Amazon lost approximately 850,000 square kilometers of forest. That's about 20% of the original forest cover in Brazil. The forest in Brazil originally covered roughly 4 million square kilometers. About 800,000 to 850,000 of those square kilometers are now degraded or gone. The peak deforestation year was 2004, when Brazil lost approximately 27,000 square kilometers of Amazon forest in 12 months. After that, the Brazilian government implemented a series of policy and enforcement measures, including real-time satellite monitoring through INPE, Brazil's National Space Research Institute, that drove annual deforestation down to about 4,500 square kilometers by 2012. That reduction is one of the most successful deforestation control efforts in history, though it rarely gets credited. Then the numbers started climbing again. Between 2018 and 2022, during the Bolsonaro administration, enforcement of environmental protections was weakened significantly, and deforestation rates climbed back above 10,000 square kilometers per year. In 2022, the last full year of that government, the Brazilian Amazon lost about 11,600 square kilometers of forest. After the change in government in January 2023, enforcement was re-strengthened. By 2024, deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon had dropped to approximately 6,000 to 7,000 square kilometers annually, still too high by the targets Brazil has set, but a significant improvement from the peak years. The drivers of deforestation are not mysterious. Cattle ranching accounts for roughly 65 to 70% of all Amazon deforestation in Brazil, according to multiple studies, including work by Philip Fearnside at Brazil's National Institute for Amazonian Research. Soy agriculture accounts for another 15 to 20%, though much of the soy expansion occurs in already deforested areas. Logging, both legal and illegal, drives most of the rest. There's also something called degradation, which isn't the same as deforestation, but is, in some ways, harder to reverse. Degraded forest looks like forest from the air. The trees are still standing. But selective logging, fire damage and edge effects, where cleared areas dry out and warm the adjacent forest, have killed off the understory, reduced species diversity, and disrupted the water cycle functions. Estimates of degraded Amazon forest run as high as 400,000 square kilometers, roughly half as much as the area that's been fully cleared. Degraded forest stores less carbon, generates less transpiration, supports fewer species, and is significantly more flammable than intact forest. The fires that hit Brazil and Bolivia in 2019 burned through large amounts of previously degraded forest. The smoke from those fires covered an area the size of Western Europe at their peak. Chapter 9. The tipping point that might already be here. In 2021, a team of researchers led by Luciana Vergara Asenjo published a paper in Nature showing something that climate scientists had been modelling theoretically for years. Parts of the Amazon had already crossed a tipping point. The analysis used satellite data from 2000 to 2018 and looked at the rate at which the Amazon's vegetation recovered after disturbances, droughts, fires, dry spells. A healthy ecosystem bounces back quickly. A stressed ecosystem bounces back slowly, and systems close to a tipping point bounce back more and more slowly, in a detectable mathematical pattern called critical slowing down. About 75% of the Amazon showed this critical slowing down signal over the study period. The southeastern Amazon, the most heavily deforested region closest to agricultural land, showed it most severely. This doesn't mean those areas have crossed the point of no return. It means they're moving toward it, and the pace of movement has accelerated. The tipping point itself, the level of deforestation and climate stress at which large portions of the Amazon transition from rainforest to a drier, savanna-like vegetation state, has been studied intensively by Carlos Nobre and Thomas Lovejoy. In papers from 2018, published in Science Advances, they estimated this threshold at around 20 to 25% deforestation. Combined with the effects of climate change, which is drying the Amazon's dry season, they suggested the effective threshold might be lower, perhaps 15 to 20%. Brazil's Amazon is currently at approximately 20 to 21% deforestation. The combined Amazon, including forest in Bolivia, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela and other countries, is at roughly 17%. These numbers are not comfortable. The Amazon's dry season has measurably lengthened over the past 4 decades. A 2019 study by Sangram Ganguly at NASA Ames Research Center and colleagues found that the dry season in southern Amazonia has extended by roughly 6.5 days per decade since the early 1980s. More days without rain means more fire risk, more stress on trees, more drying at forest edges. The 2023 drought, triggered by a combination of El Niño conditions and climate-driven regional warming, was severe enough to kill dolphins in the Tefé River in western Brazil. The water temperature in some stretches rose above 39 degrees Celsius. Over 150 pink river dolphins and dozens of Tucuxi dolphins died within a few weeks. This wasn't a fire. This was water, just too warm, carrying too little oxygen. Chapter 10. What happens elsewhere? If a tipping point is crossed, If a substantial portion of the eastern and southern Amazon transitions from rainforest to savanna, the effects won't stay in South America. The Amazon contains an estimated 150 to 200 billion metric tons of carbon in its living biomass and soil. For comparison, global fossil fuel emissions were about 37 billion metric tons of CO2 in 2023. A dieback of the Amazon would release carbon over decades, not all at once, but the cumulative addition to the atmosphere would be significant. Estimates from climate models range from 50 to 90 billion metric tons of net carbon release if the forest fully collapses. That alone would push global temperatures up by roughly 0.3 to 0.5 degrees Celsius on top of whatever warming occurs from other sources. The flying rivers would weaken. Southern Brazil, which now receives 40 to 70% of its rainfall from Amazon moisture, according to modeling work by Domingos Savio Rodrigues, would receive less. The São Paulo metropolitan region, 22 million people, already experienced a severe water crisis in 2014 and 2015, when reservoirs dropped to less than 5% capacity. The role of Amazon deforestation in reducing regional rainfall was identified as a contributing factor in a 2021 study by Vita Pontes and colleagues published in the journal Weather and Climate Extremes. Bolivia and Paraguay, which rely on the flying rivers for much of their agricultural rainfall, would face drying. Northern Argentina's soy and wheat belts could see reduced precipitation. Outside South America, the Amazon's influence on global atmospheric circulation means a forest dieback would alter precipitation patterns in parts of West Africa, according to climate modelling work published by Swapna Vaidyanathan and colleagues. The precise magnitude and geographic distribution of those effects remain contested in the modelling literature. The teleconnection pathways between Amazon deforestation and rainfall in other continents are real but complex, and different climate models don't fully agree on the details. What models do agree on is that the Amazon is not a regional concern. It's a planetary one. Chapter 11. What's still being discovered? The current pace of new findings about the Amazon is genuinely hard to keep up with. In 2021, researchers using environmental DNA analysis taking water samples and extracting trace DNA shed by organisms living in the water, identified hundreds of species in Amazon rivers without ever netting, trapping, or directly observing them. The method, called eDNA meta-barcoding, has made species surveys dramatically faster and has revealed communities of organisms in Amazon waterways that weren't in any prior surveys. In 2022, a paper in Nature, Ecology and Evolution by Ted Laboutis and colleagues described dozens of new species of electric fish in the Amazon. Fish that generate electric fields for navigation and communication in murky water. The Amazon's electric fish have been studied since the 1950s, and researchers thought the major lineages were mostly documented. They weren't. Several major evolutionary branches had been sitting in museum collections, misidentified for decades. The acoustic ecology of the Amazon is now being studied systematically. Researchers deploy automated sound recorders in the forest and analyze the recordings using machine learning to identify species from their calls: birds, frogs, insects. A 2023 study using this method in Brazilian Amazon sites found that acoustic biodiversity was a reliable indicator of overall ecosystem health, and that degraded forests had measurably reduced acoustic complexity even when they still looked intact from above. There's ongoing work on Amazon cloud formation. In 2012, a team led by Meinrad Andrea at the Max Planck Institute published findings in Science showing that the Amazon produces its own cloud condensation nuclei, tiny particles that serve as seeds for cloud droplets, primarily from biogenic compounds released by trees and soil bacteria. Over intact forest, these natural particles dominate. Over deforested areas, smoke and dust from human activity take over. The type of condensation nuclei affects how clouds form and how much rain they produce. This means the Amazon's cloud physics are partly regulated by the biology of the forest itself. In 2023, a study in the journal Current Biology by Scott Jarvie and colleagues analyzed distribution data for 1,000 Amazon bird species against climate projections. It found that under mid-range warming scenarios, roughly 40% of the Amazon's bird species would face either range loss or range shifts significant enough to require major behavioral or physiological changes by 2080. About 5% faced projected range losses so severe that extinction risk would substantially increase. Birds are ecological indicators. They sit at multiple levels of food chains, eating insects, fruit, small vertebrates, and they're sensitive to temperature, vegetation structure, and food availability. When bird communities start changing, it's typically a signal that multiple other things are changing first. The Amazon's insects are increasingly the subject of long-term monitoring as well. German researchers at the Nourags research station in French Guiana and Brazilian researchers at several Amazon sites have been running insect biomass traps for years. The data on trends are still sparse compared to European insect monitoring programs. But the Amazon insect community, which makes up the largest fraction of the forest's animal biodiversity, is almost entirely unmonitored in most of the basin. We don't know what's happening to it. Chapter 12. The people still there. There are currently an estimated 300 to 400 distinct indigenous groups living in the Amazon basin. About 130 of those groups, the exact count changes as new contacts are made and populations are reassessed, are considered uncontacted or in voluntary isolation. They've chosen not to engage with outside society, or the circumstances of their situation have kept them separate. Brazil's FUNAI, the National Indian Foundation, maintains a policy of not approaching these groups without their express desire for contact. The policy was formalized after decades of disastrous first contacts in the 20th century, in which outside contact, even well-intentioned contact, repeatedly introduced disease and disrupted communities in ways that were lethal. The Kawahiva people in Mato Grosso state are one of these groups. FUNAI has documented their presence through artifacts, camps, and occasional aerial sightings, but has never made direct contact. As of the early 2020s, their territory was under severe encroachment pressure from illegal logging and agricultural expansion. The legal protections for indigenous territories in Brazil's constitution, specifically Article 231, established in 1988, are the most significant formal protection the Amazon has. Indigenous territories cover approximately 1.17 million square kilometers of the Brazilian Amazon, and deforestation rates inside those territories are dramatically lower than in surrounding areas. A 2020 study by Claudia Stickler and colleagues at Brazil's Amazon Environmental Research Institute found that indigenous territories showed deforestation rates roughly 10 times lower than comparable non-indigenous areas. The legal framework protecting those territories has been under sustained challenge in Brazilian courts. In 2023, the Brazilian Supreme Court ruled in favor of maintaining full protections for indigenous territories against a challenge that would have allowed the government to reduce protections for lands not formally claimed before 1988. The ruling was narrow, decided 9-2, and the legal pressure on indigenous land rights continues. The approximately 1.5 to 1.7 million people currently living in the Amazon as indigenous community members are not museum exhibits of a pre-contact past. They're people who have continued adapting their land practices, their governance systems, and their knowledge over centuries. The ecological knowledge embedded in communities that have managed specific forest regions for dozens of generations is not catalogued anywhere. When those communities are displaced or reduced, that knowledge disappears permanently. Conclusion. In 2011, Valia Hamza found a river 4,000 meters underground that had been there since before humans existed. In 2022, archaeologists found a city under the trees that had been there for 1,000 years. Neither of those things waited to be found. They were simply waiting. The Amazon is 55 million years old as a river system. The forest covering it is roughly 34 million years old, in something close to its current form. We've been studying it systematically for maybe 200 years, and seriously, with satellites and DNA analysis and LiDAR, for about 40. In 40 years of serious study, we've found underground rivers, flying rivers, ancient cities, manufactured soils, undescribed species at 1.7 per day, and a water cycle that runs the agricultural economy of half a continent. We've also removed 20% of the Brazilian portion of the forest. We're approaching the threshold that models say triggers irreversible change. The dry season is getting longer. The tipping point signal is detectable in satellite data. The forest that took 34 million years to build took 50 years of chainsaw and fire to cut down 1/5 of. The Hamza River is still down there, moving 1 millimeter per day, completely indifferent to what's happening above it. The question is, what's left up top for it to flow beneath.